The screaming stopped when the blood hit the floor. Not from a hit, but from the 14th nanny taking a porcelain vase to the skull. Then came the maid. Minimum wage, maxed out credit, and absolutely no patience for a billionaire's feral toddler. She didn't flinch. She just handed him a rag. The Cole estate didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress pretending to be a house. Brutalist concrete sheets of tinted glass that reflected the steel-grey Chicago sky, and wrought-iron gates thick enough to stop a truck. Tessa stood at the service entrance, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Her left shoe was a half size too small, a thrift store find that pinched her heel with every step. Inside her right shoe, a folded piece of junk mail was doing a miserable job of covering a hole in the sole. The chill of the pavement seeped through the damp paper creeping up her leg. She shivered, pulling the thin, scratchy wool of her second-hand coat tighter across her chest. She needed this job. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door wasn't a suggestion. It was a countdown. 72 hours before she and her mother's oxygen tanks were put out on the curb. The heavy steel door clicked open. A woman in a severe black dress, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, eyed Tessa up and down. Her gaze snagged on the frayed cuffs of Tessa's coat, the cheap synthetic blend of her skirt, and the exhausted dark circles bruised beneath her eyes. "You're late," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was like dry leaves scraping on concrete. "The bus broke down on 4th, Tessa replied, stepping inside. The air in the service corridor smelled of industrial bleach and lemon pledge, masking something stale beneath it. "I ran the last 2 miles. Your excuses are not my payroll problem. Put this on." Mrs. Gable shoved a folded grey uniform into Tessa's arms. The polyester blend felt slick and cheap against her skin. "You're here to clean, not to speak, not to look the men in the eyes. If you see men in suits carrying heavy bags, you look at the baseboards. Understood? Understood." Tessa knew who Gideon Cole was. Everyone in the city knew. He owned the shipping yards, half the politicians, and supposedly a very deep quarry out past city limits, where people who crossed him tended to end up. But organised crime didn't scare Tessa right now. Starvation did. Before Tessa could change, a high-pitched guttural scream echoed down the cavernous main hallway. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a roar of absolute, unadulterated rage. A loud crack followed, the distinct sound of fine porcelain shattering against marble. "Christ, not again," Mrs. Gable muttered, pinching the bridge of her nose. Tessa peeked around the corner. The main foyer was a sprawling expanse of white marble and cold, geometric light fixtures. At the centre of the room, a woman in a starched white nanny's uniform was scrambling backward on her hands and knees. Blood trickled from a nasty gash above her left eyebrow, bright crimson against her pale skin. Standing at the top of the sweeping glass staircase was a toddler. He couldn't have been older than 3. He wore a pair of dark velvet overalls, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. His chest heaved. In his chubby, dimpled hand, he held the heavy brass base of what used to be a table lamp. He looked like a cornered wolverine. "I quit!" the nanny shrieked, scrambling to her feet. She slipped on a piece of broken porcelain, tearing the knee of her stockings, but managed to right herself. "He's an animal! The boy is a feral animal!" Heavy, measured footsteps echoed from the upper landing. Tessa pressed her back against the wall, but she couldn't look away. Gideon Cole descended the stairs. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator that knows all the exits are locked. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that looked like armour. His tie was loosened, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. He bypassed the furious toddler entirely, walking down to the foyer. He smelled of cold air, expensive scotch, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. He didn't look at the bleeding woman. He just reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and scrawled a number with a silver pen. He tore the check free and let it flutter to the marble floor. "There's an extra 20,000 for the stitches," Gideon said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Tessa's chest. It was entirely devoid of emotion. "You signed an NDA. I suggest you remember that." The nanny snatched the check from the floor, pressed a tissue to her bleeding head, and bolted out the heavy oak front doors. The slam rattled the glass panes. Silence descended on the house, heavy, suffocating silence. At the top of the stairs, the toddler let out a ragged, gasping sob, dropping the brass lamp base. It hit the glass step with a deafening clatter. Gideon looked up at his son. His jaw tightened. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. He didn't climb the stairs to comfort the boy. He just turned his head, his sharp grey eyes locking onto the service corridor. Locking onto Tessa. She stopped breathing. "You," Gideon said. Tessa stepped out of the shadows. She clutched the cheap grey uniform to her chest. "Sir, are you the new maid?" "Yes." Gideon gestured vaguely to the shattered porcelain and blood on the floor. "Clean this up, then go to the 3rd floor. Clean the playroom." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked down a long hallway, flanked by 2 massive men in dark suits, who seemed to materialize out of the shadows. Tessa looked up at the top of the stairs. The boy, Theo, was glaring down at her, his little chest heaving. Tessa didn't smile at him. She didn't offer a soothing coo. She just walked to the utility closet, grabbed a heavy-duty broom and a dustpan, and walked out into the foyer. "You got good aim, kid," she muttered, sweeping a jagged piece of porcelain into the pan. "But you missed the rug. Now I have to mop." Theo blinked, his tiny fists unclenching. He turned and vanished into the upper hallways. The 3rd floor smelled distinctly of sour milk, expensive cedar wood, and pure malice. Tessa pushed the heavy oak door open with her hip, carrying a plastic bucket of warm, soapy water and a stack of microfiber rags. The playroom was massive, roughly the size of Tessa's entire apartment block, and it was utterly destroyed. Wooden blocks were scattered like shrapnel. Books with torn pages littered the Persian rug. Finger paints, mercifully non-toxic, were smeared across a massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the bleak winter landscape. There was no sign of Theo. Tessa set the bucket down. Her joints popped as she sank to her knees. She was so tired her bones felt like lead. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, half a piece of toast to settle the acid in her empty stomach. Her hands were raw from the cold, the skin cracking around her cuticles. She started picking up the wooden blocks, tossing them into a canvas toy bin. Clack, clack, clack. The rhythmic sound was almost soothing. She reached for a blue block near the edge of a heavy velvet sofa. A sharp, hard object slammed into her shin. "Mother!" Tessa bit her tongue, swallowing the curse. She dropped the rag and grabbed her leg. A solid wooden fire engine lay on the floor, fresh from bouncing off her shin bone. It hurt. A deep, radiating ache that promised a spectacular purple bruise by morning. From the dark space beneath the velvet sofa, a pair of grey eyes glared out at her. The whites of the boy's eyes were stark in the shadows. He looked like a stray dog expecting a kick. He had his little hand wrapped around another wooden truck, winding up to throw. Tessa didn't scramble away. She didn't yell for help. She didn't put on a fake sing-song voice and try to coax him out. She didn't have the energy for theatre. She just sat back on her heels, rubbed her shin and looked at him. "That was a solid hit," Tessa said, her voice flat, conversational. "But if you throw that second one, I'm tossing it out the window." Theo froze. His brow furrowed. He was used to screaming. He was used to panic. He was used to nannies trying to grab his wrists while speaking in high-pitched, fake sweet voices. He wasn't used to a tired woman in an ill-fitting grey dress looking at him like he was just another bad roommate. Tessa sighed, letting her shoulders slump. She didn't care about the cameras that were undoubtedly watching her. She reached into the deep pocket of her uniform apron and pulled out a squashed, slightly stale granola bar. It was supposed to be her dinner. She ripped the silver wrapper open with her teeth. The crinkling sound was loud in the quiet room. She took a bite, chewed slowly. The oats were dry, but the sugar hit her bloodstream like a jolt of electricity. Beneath the sofa, Theo shifted. The wooden truck slipped from his hand. He watched her chew, his little nose twitching. He hadn't eaten his lunch. He had thrown his lunch at the chef. Tessa broke off a piece of the granola bar. She didn't hand it to him. She just placed it on the floor, halfway between her knees and the sofa. Then she picked up her rag and started wiping down the sticky finger paint on the floorboards, keeping her back half turned to him, For 5 minutes, the only sound was the damp squeak of the rag on wood. Then she heard the soft rustle of velvet, the tiny sticky slap of bare feet on the hardwood. She didn't look up. She kept wiping. A small, dirty hand reached out and snatched the piece of granola. She heard him chewing. Fast, desperate little crunches. Tessa stopped scrubbing. She sat back, resting her hands on her thighs. Theo was standing 3 feet away. His face was smeared with old tears and red paint. He looked up at her, chewing defensively. "Not bad, right?" Tessa murmured. "Cheaper than the stuff you probably get, but it does the trick." Theo stared at her. He took a hesitant step forward. He smelled intensely of baby sweat and the lingering metallic scent of the blood he'd caused earlier. He looked at her bruised shin, then up at her face. Tessa didn't move. She let him navigate the space. He stepped closer, standing right between her knees. He looked down at his own sticky, paint-covered hands. Then, with a jerky, uncoordinated movement, he leaned forward. He didn't bite her. He didn't hit her. He pressed his small, wet mouth against her cheek. It was a sloppy, sticky kiss, tasting of cheap oats and smelling of dried paint. He lingered there for a second, his little chest resting against her collarbone. Tessa's breath hitched. A strange, sharp ache clamped down on her chest. She had prepared herself for a fight. She hadn't prepared herself for the desperate, crushing loneliness of a child who just wanted someone to stay still. Slowly, carefully, she raised her hand and rested it on his back. His little body shuddered, and he buried his face in her neck, clinging to her cheap polyester collar. In the open doorway of the playroom, standing perfectly still, was Gideon Cole. Tessa didn't know how long he had been there. The shadows draped over him, hiding his expression. But his grey eyes were locked on her. The cold, dead emptiness in his gaze was gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing intensity that made the hair on the back of Tessa's neck stand up. He didn't say a word. He just watched her hold his son, and then, as silently as a ghost, he turned and vanished down the hall. The mansion at 2 a.m. felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The heavy silence pressed against the eardrums, broken only by the low industrial hum of the commercial refrigerators in the main kitchen. Tessa stood over the massive stainless steel sink. The sleeves of her grey uniform rolled up past her elbows. The water was scalding, turning her forearms a mottled pink. But she welcomed the burn. It kept her awake. She had spent the last 4 hours scrubbing grout in the East Wing, and her lower back screamed with every movement. She turned off the faucet, the sudden absence of running water leaving a ringing in her ears. She grabbed a clean towel and dried her hands, wincing as the rough fabric caught on a fresh blister. She turned to grab her bucket and jumped so hard she nearly slipped on the wet tile. Gideon Cole was sitting at the massive granite island in the dark. He was out of his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves pushed up to reveal heavy black ink wrapping around his thick forearms. Tattoos, the kind you didn't get in a parlour. A heavy crystal tumbler sat in front of him, the amber liquid inside catching the faint light from the stove clock. He didn't look startled by her gasp. He had been waiting. "You don't make much noise when you work," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, blending perfectly with the shadows of the room. Tessa swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. She smoothed the front of her damp apron. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. I didn't see you there. I'm just finishing up. Sleeve it?" He picked up his glass, took a slow drink and set it down. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, echoing sound. "Sit down." It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Tessa hesitated. Every survival instinct she had honed on the streets of the South Side screamed at her to keep moving, to make herself small, to apologize and back out of the room. Men like Gideon Cole didn't ask the help to sit down unless they wanted something, or unless they were about to punish a transgression. But her feet hurt. God, her feet hurt, and the chair looked soft. She walked over, pulling out a heavy wooden stool at the opposite end of the island, leaving 6 feet of polished granite between them. She sat on the edge of the seat, her spine rigidly straight. Gideon watched her. His eyes were the colour of a stormy sea, dark and turbulent, yet utterly unreadable. He catalogued her. He saw the cheap, worn-out shoes. He saw the damp hem of her skirt. He saw the way she held her breath, not out of awe, but out of calculated caution. 14 nannies in 6 months, Gideon stated, his voice flat. 3 of them went to the hospital. 2 threatened to sue. 1 actually tried, until my lawyers explained the reality of her situation to her. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the cold stone. Theo is violent. He is unpredictable. He broke a woman's head open this morning, and yet I checked the security footage from the playroom today. You sat on the floor, let him hit you with a wooden truck, and then shared your lunch with him. Tessa kept her eyes on the grain of the granite. He was hungry. He has a private chef. He has a chef who makes food he doesn't want to eat, in a house where nobody talks to him unless they're yelling or terrified of him. Tessa bit her tongue. Too far. She had gone too far. She braced herself for the anger, for the immediate dismissal. Gideon didn't yell. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. You think you understand my son after one afternoon? No, sir. Tessa looked up, meeting his gaze. She was too tired to filter herself. The exhaustion stripped away her fear, leaving only a raw, cynical honesty. I don't understand your son. I understand being small and scared, and realizing that throwing things is the only way to make the giant people in the room pay attention to you. Gideon stared at her. The silence stretched thick and heavy. He smelled like scotch, expensive wood smoke, and beneath it all, the sharp, metallic tang of blood that had been washed away but never really leaves a man. Tessa knew what he was. The papers called him a logistics magnate. The people in her neighborhood called him the butcher of the Gold Coast. Why didn't you run? Gideon asked softly. When the glass shattered in the foyer. The others always run. You just picked up a broom. I need the money, Tessa said bluntly. Everyone needs money. I need rent by Thursday, or my mother and I are on the street, Tessa clarified, her tone devoid of self-pity. It was just math. Brutal, simple math. Your kid throws a block at my leg. I get a bruise. I get evicted in February. My mother gets pneumonia. The bruise is easier. Gideon picked up his glass. He didn't drink. He just rolled the cold crystal between his palms. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who lied to him. Sycophants who wanted his money, rivals who wanted his territory, women who wanted his status. They all wore masks. They all played games. This woman, sitting across from him in a damp grey uniform, wasn't playing a game. She was stripping the meat right off the bone. She didn't care about his money, his power, or his reputation. She just cared about survival. He found it violently fascinating. Show me your leg, he said. Tessa blinked, her posture stiffening. Excuse me? The bruise, Gideon said, his tone perfectly even. He hit you with the wooden fire engine. Solid oak. Must weigh 2 pounds. Show it to me. Tessa hesitated. She looked at the dark hallway, then back at him. Slowly, she reached down and pulled the hem of her thick, opaque tights up just past her ankle, revealing her lower shin. A massive, ugly welt had bloomed across her pale skin. It was an angry, mottled purple in the centre, ringed with dark red and yellow. It looked painful. It was painful. Gideon stared at the bruise. His jaw clenched. A muscle ticked in his cheek. He didn't look at it with pity. He looked at it like a man assessing collateral damage. He stood up. He was massive, his shadow falling over her as he walked around the island. Tessa instinctively gripped the edge of her stool, her knuckles turning white. Gideon stopped right in front of her. He didn't touch her. He just looked down at the bruise and then up at her face. He's angry, Gideon said quietly. His mother... He stopped. The words seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. His mother died violently, right in front of him, 6 months ago. He hasn't spoken a single word since that night. He only screams. Tessa felt the breath leave her lungs. She looked at Gideon's face, the harsh lines, the dark shadows under his eyes. Suddenly the fortress made sense. The heavy security, the dead emptiness in his gaze. This wasn't just a mob boss hiding from his enemies. This was a man drowning in grief, entirely incapable of saving his drowning son. I'm sorry, Tessa whispered. Don't be. Pity is useless. Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick money clip. He peeled off $500 bills and dropped them onto the granite counter next to her hand. "Buy better shoes. The ones you're wearing are ruining my floors." Tessa stared at the money, $500, half her rent, just sitting there. She looked up, but Gideon was already turning away, walking back into the dark corridor of the mansion. "Be in the playroom at 8 sharp, his voice drifted back through the shadows. "He likes the red blocks best." The new shoes were black, slip-resistant, and entirely devoid of style. They were also the most comfortable things Tessa had ever put on her feet. 2 weeks had passed since the night in the kitchen. Tessa's mother had her oxygen tanks, the landlord had his rent, and the eviction notice was burning in a landfill somewhere outside the city limits. Tessa still scrubbed toilets. She still hauled heavy bags of trash down the service elevator. But at exactly 8 o'clock every morning she walked into the third-floor playroom and the screaming stopped. Theo still didn't speak, but he no longer threw things. Tessa sat cross-legged on the thick Persian rug, a worn deck of playing cards spread out between her knees. Theo sat opposite her, his velvet overalls stained with dried purple marker. He was methodically stacking the red cards into a messy, unstable pyramid. The room smelled of rain beating against the heavy glass windows and the warm, slightly sweet scent of the chamomile tea Tessa had smuggled up from the kitchen. The heavy oak door swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gideon stepped inside. He wore a dark navy suit today, the fabric impeccably tailored, moving fluidly over his broad shoulders. But there was a harsh, jagged edge to him this morning. A smudge of dark grease, or perhaps dried blood, stained the stark white cuff of his shirt. He smelled of cold asphalt, stale cigarette smoke, and adrenaline. Theo froze, his tiny hand hovering over the card pyramid. He didn't look at his father. He looked at Tessa. "Keep building, kid," Tessa murmured, not breaking her gaze from the cards. "You need the 8 of diamonds next." Theo hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand, carefully placing the card. Gideon watched the exchange. He walked further into the room, his leather shoes silent on the rug. He stopped a few feet from them, towering over their game. "My head of security quit this morning," Gideon said. His voice was a flat, gravelly scrape in the quiet room. "Said the perimeter isn't secure. Said he couldn't guarantee the safety of the house." Tessa picked up the jack of spades, flipping it over in her palm. "Are you telling me this so I know to mop the security office? Or are you telling me because you want me to be scared?" Gideon crouched down. His joints didn't pop. He moved with the terrifying, oiled precision of a machine. He was now eye level with Tessa. Up close, the exhaustion in his grey eyes was absolute. It was a bone-deep weariness that money couldn't cure. "I'm telling you because men who want me dead are currently probing the weak spots in my defences," Gideon replied, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "And this house is a massive, glaring target." "So fire me," Tessa said. She didn't flinch. "Pay me out for the week and send me home." "I can't." "Why not?" Gideon looked at his son. Theo had stopped building. He was watching his father with wide, hyper-vigilant eyes, his little fingers clutching a red card so tightly his knuckles were white. "Because he slept through the night yesterday," Gideon said softly, "for the first time in 6 months. He didn't wake up screaming." Gideon shifted his gaze back to Tessa. "You don't coddle him. You don't lie to him. You sit on the floor and let him exist. If I send you away, he goes back to breaking the furniture. I can manage a war in the streets, Tessa. I cannot manage a war inside this house." Tessa swallowed. Her throat was dry. This was the trap. The money had been the bait, but the quiet, desperate dependence of this broken child and the hollow, agonizing grief of his father were the steel jaws snapping shut around her ankle. "I'm a maid," Tessa said, her voice tight. "I clean the grout. I don't dodge bullets." "Nobody's going to shoot at you," Gideon said. He reached out, his large, calloused hand brushing against the deck of cards on the floor. His knuckles grazed the back of Tessa's hand. His skin was burning hot. Tessa jolted, pulling her hand back slightly. Gideon didn't apologize. He just watched the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. "I have 40 armed men patrolling the grounds," Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a low hypnotic rumble. "The glass is bulletproof. The walls are reinforced steel. You are safer in this house than you have ever been in your entire life. Safety is an illusion, Tessa shot back, her cynicism acting as a shield against the sudden, suffocating proximity of him. People like you always think walls can keep the monsters out, but you brought the monsters in with you. A dark, humorless smile touched the corner of Gideon's mouth. You have a sharp tongue for someone who works for minimum wage. Poverty doesn't make you stupid, it just makes you tired. Gideon stared at her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken violence and an uncomfortable heavy tension that had nothing to do with fear. It was the recognition of two people who had both learned to survive in the dark, just on different sides of the tracks. Before Gideon could speak again, the house shuddered. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a deep, concussive thud that vibrated up through the floorboards, rattling the heavy glass in the window frames. Instantly, a piercing high-decibel siren ruptured the quiet. The overhead lights snapped off, replaced immediately by the harsh, rotating red glare of emergency strobes. Theo screamed. It wasn't a scream of rage this time. It was pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled backward, hitting the velvet sofa and curling into a tight, trembling ball covering his ears. Gideon was on his feet before Tessa could blink. The bespoke suit jacket was cast aside. He reached to the small of his back and suddenly a dull black semi-automatic weapon was in his hand. The safety clicked off. The sound was deafening in the small space between the sirens. "Get him," Gideon barked, his eyes scanning the dark hallway outside the open playroom door. He was no longer the exhausted father. He was the butcher. "Take him to the panic room behind the library. Do not stop. Do not look out the windows." Tessa didn't ask questions. She scrambled across the rug on her hands and knees. She grabbed Theo. The boy fought her, his little limbs thrashing, his fingernails catching her cheek and drawing blood. "Stop!" Tessa hissed, grabbing him by the straps of his overalls and hauling him hard against her chest. "Theo, stop! I've got you! I've got you!" She wrapped her arms around him, burying his face in her neck, absorbing his panic. She pushed herself up to her feet. Her heart was hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs. The smell of burning rubber and cordite drifted through the ventilation shafts. Gideon stood in the doorway providing cover. He looked back at her, his jaw locked in a rigid line. "Move," he commanded. Tessa ran. The air in the hallway was thick with smoke. Shouting echoed from the ground floor, gruff panicked voices followed by the sharp, terrifying pop of small arms fire. Tessa sprinted down the corridor, Theo a heavy, dead weight against her chest. Her slip-resistant shoes gripped the hardwood, saving her as she took the corner toward the back staircase too fast. The red emergency lights washed everything in the colour of fresh blood. She hit the second-floor landing. The library was at the end of the east wing. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets shattered the massive decorative vase at the end of the hall. Ceramic shrapnel exploded outward. Tessa screamed, twisting her body to shield Theo. A jagged piece of porcelain sliced through the thin fabric of her uniform, biting deep into her shoulder. She stumbled, slamming hard into the oak panelling of the wall. Pain flared hot and bright, but she didn't drop the boy. "Keep moving!" Gideon roared from the top of the stairs behind her. He fired twice down into the foyer. The sound was physically punishing, compressing the air in Tessa's lungs. She forced her legs to work. She hit the library doors, shoving them open with her shoulder. The room was dark, smelling of old paper and leather polish. "The bookshelf," Gideon ordered, right on her heels. He slammed the heavy double doors shut, locking the deadbolts. "Third row, pull the brass spine." Tessa lunged for the shelves. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed the fake book twice. She finally hooked her fingers around the cold brass, pulling hard. With a heavy hydraulic hiss, the massive mahogany bookcase swung outward, revealing a solid steel door. A keypad glowed dull green in the dark. Gideon punched in a sequence of numbers, his hand steady despite the chaos outside. The steel door unsealed. "Get in!" He shoved her inside, stepping in after and hitting the lock button. The heavy door sealed shut, cutting off the sirens, the gunfire, and the smell of smoke. The panic room was small, lit by a harsh fluorescent bulb. It held cots, water rations, and a bank of security monitors currently showing chaotic feeds of the mansion. Tessa collapsed against the cold steel wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her breathing was ragged, torn gasps that burned her throat. Theo was still clutching her neck, his small body vibrating with silent sobs. Tessa winced, reaching up to touch her shoulder. Her hand came away wet and sticky. Dark crimson soaked the cheap grey polyester. Gideon dropped his weapon onto a steel table. He turned to look at the monitors, his chest heaving under his white shirt. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, a string of vicious curses spilling from his lips. Then he turned around. He saw the blood. The anger vanished from his face, replaced by something entirely different. He crossed the small room in 2 strides, dropping to his knees on the concrete floor in front of her. "You're hit," he said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual armour. "Just glass," Tessa managed to choke out. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her dizzy and nauseous. "I covered him. He's okay." Gideon didn't look at his son. He looked at her. He looked at the ugly, jagged tear in her uniform and the blood seeping through her fingers. He reached out, his large hands gently prying Theo from her grip. He set the boy down on one of the cots, handing him a sealed bottle of water. Theo took it, staring blankly at the wall. Gideon turned back to Tessa. He didn't ask permission. He gripped the collar of her ruined uniform and ripped it down, exposing the wound on her shoulder. Tessa hissed, trying to pull away. "Don't!" "Hold still," Gideon commanded, but his voice was shaking. He grabbed a first aid kit from the wall, ripping open a package of gauze. He pressed it hard against the cut. Tessa gasped, her head falling back against the steel wall. She closed her eyes, fighting the wave of blackness creeping into her peripheral vision. Gideon crouched between her knees, his presence overwhelming in the small sterile room. He applied pressure to the wound, his knuckles brushing against the bare skin of her collarbone. "You didn't run," Gideon whispered. His voice was close, too close. Tessa opened her eyes. Gideon's face was mere inches from hers. The grey in his eyes wasn't cold anymore. It was burning. The carefully constructed fortress of the Mafia boss was entirely gone, leaving only a desperate, terrified man. "I couldn't leave him," Tessa breathed, her voice trembling. "I know what it's like to be left." Gideon stared at her mouth. He looked at the exhaustion bruising her eyes, the cheap uniform, the blood. He saw the sheer, unadulterated grit of a woman who had nothing, yet gave everything to a child that wasn't hers. He didn't think. For the first time in his meticulously calculated life, he just reacted. Gideon shifted his grip, sliding his free hand into her hair, gripping the back of her neck. He pulled her forward and crushed his mouth to hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was an impact. It tasted of copper blood, stale adrenaline, and raw, jagged need. It was a collision of 2 people trying to prove to themselves that they were still breathing. Tessa didn't push him away. The cynicism, the rules, the survival instincts, they all burned up in the heat of his mouth. She reached up with her good arm, her fingers twisting into the expensive fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, angry desperation. He was ruin. He was danger. He was the reason she was bleeding in a steel box. But right now, he was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. Gideon broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers. They were both panting, breathing the same recycled air. "You're staying," Gideon stated, his voice a ragged whisper against her lips. It wasn't a request. Tessa looked into the dark, violent storm of his eyes. She felt the heavy throbbing in her shoulder, the cold concrete beneath her, and the terrifying warmth of the man kneeling before her. "You're paying for a new coat," Tessa whispered back. A quiet, genuine laugh, rough and unused, vibrated deep in Gideon's chest. He pressed his lips to the crown of her head, pulling her against him. Outside the steel door, the sirens wailed, but inside the dark, the screaming had finally stopped. Did you feel the tension in the coal estate? If Tessa and Gideon's gritty, slow-burn survival story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't leave them in the dark. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video with fellow dark romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, grounded storytelling. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed for double the pay or run for the door? See you next time.